Okay then, and welcome committee. As some of you just heard, Gina is joining us, notwithstanding her unfortunate injury, and we're honored, Gina, to have you with us.
Thank you, Rich.
Peter's tied up in the legislature, doing great work there. And we do have a quorum, so let's get going. The main topics for today are a legislative update, a discussion of next steps on transportation, and a substantial amount of time devoted to hearing about the Vermont Pathways report. Is there anything else that people would like to put on the agenda? All right, not hearing anything. Are there any concerns regarding the minutes of the last meeting on January 20? And hearing no objection, as usual, we'll consider them to be approved. Anything from you, Jane, about procedural issues or updates from the administrative side of the committee?
Nothing in particular comes to mind, except for one component. Just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the email that I sent out, I believe yesterday or the day before, around subcommittee nominations. Your subcommittee, as well as Ag and Ecosystems, has highlighted a need for additional subcommittee members at this time, but 3 subcommittees have vacancies, as well, in particular highlighted technical expertise needed for this next phase of work. So just want to draw your attention to that email, and if you have ideas, there's a survey nomination, not dissimilar from the way we proceeded a year ago now. Marion just dropped it in the chat. So encourage folks to take a look, and if you have suggestions on either any of the expertise for science needed for science and data, just transitions, or rural resilience and adaptation, it'd be great to get some broader input on that. So that's it for now, and the council meetings have been set. Our next council meeting is March 7th.
Thanks, Jane. Joey?
Thanks, Jane. That's super helpful. And also following up on another email you sent related to the short and sweet memo that came out of the steering committee related to the technical analysis. Can you just give a quick update on, is the steering committee meeting again soon, and like sort of what the steering committee, okay, just any update related to the steering committee's work that would be relevant for us to hear would be super helpful beyond what I see in that short memo.
Sure. And I invite Jared and anyone else to jump in too. But you may recall at the last council meeting, there was an interest for the council to see a full scale and scope of the technical analyses that are proposed in the climate action plan, knowing that in addition, other priorities have emerged as work has continued this year. So for the steering committee meeting on Monday of this week, I put together all of the technical analyses that I understood from the climate action plan, as well as the additional ones, and worked to the best of my ability to provide cost estimates for all of them. And then based on our remaining budget, at which we have roughly $460,000 of unobligated technical analysis funds in the GWSA budget, illustrated where we intend to spend those, and then highlighted the unfunded technical analysis needs, of which they total more than $500,000. And so there was the interest from the steering committee, understanding that the legislature is currently in a critical time around budgeting, letting them be put on notice around the process and procedural conversations that were happening first at the steering committee, and then ultimately for the full council to weigh in on March 7th. And that notice is just that, a notice of process, with the understanding and expectation that the council will now consider sort of a three-pronged approach to that conversation on the 7th. One, and at that point, we'll be able to present on our budget as best, like we'll have a pretty good understanding of what the expectation is for a fiscal year 23 budget. Regardless of that, we have been able to identify clearly an additional $100,000 that we know we will have for fiscal year 23 to put towards some technical analysis, in addition to the components that we already have slotted with our remaining funds. So there'll be a conversation around agreement on a priority for us to fund with that $100,000, and then a review of all the other unfunded technical analyses for on behalf of the council to consider putting forward a request to the legislature for additional funding. And I will say that that conversation kind of has been muddied around with the timing, knowing that the administration can't participate in that this year because we support the governor's budget. However, there was a conversation about how this process could play out in future years, with the expectation that there's a role for the council to play clearly going forward in driving budgetary priorities on behalf of the council to inform the governor's budget, so that we would also talk about a budget process for the fall so that we can be better prepared to inform the governor's budget next year. And I will just say that that $100,000, there's a strong interest, I think, to use that $100,000 towards further analysis in the space of the greenhouse gas inventory, whether that be for the life cycle analyses or the furthering of the natural and working land sector. However, the natural and working land sector is under consideration for Climate Alliance grant, and we met with Megan and others met with the Climate Alliance this week and have gotten a favorable input from them that we should move forward with submitting a grant for the natural and working land sector. So we feel relatively comfortable that there's a funding source that could go to the natural and working land sector. So I think that starts to sort of support the need for the $100,000 to go towards the RFI and ultimately the RFP and the life cycle analysis phase. So we'll be prepared to talk about that with the council on March 7th in more details. And of course, as we talk about transportation today too, that we have an idea of how to fund that with multiple sources of funding now. And so maybe I'll just save that for as we start to dive into the transportation conversation. So yeah, that notification was sent to the legislature, the General Assembly today.
Thanks, Jane. Now on to legislative updates. Peter's not here, so I'll probably have a free-for-all asking for comments from folks about legislative updates. But let me just start with the clean heat standard and report that the bill has advanced quite significantly in House Energy and Technology. And Peter is going to be with the committee this afternoon, working through some final relatively small scale edits to the bill, which is in close to final form. And I think the expectation is that that committee will vote out a committee bill by the end of this week or early next week. And thanks to a number of people who have been working really hard to advance that bill in line with the recommendations that the Climate Council made for action this session. The bill is in really good shape. And anybody want to, Peter was going to talk about weatherization and the environmental justice bill, but perhaps others of you have been following them and you can say something about it. Joey, Jared, are you familiar with? Oh, go ahead, Jen.
I can just say something on behalf of the state staff for weatherization and just say that we've been going back and forth with Chair Bray and that on the components of the work that he wants to now shift to once he redirects the focus of his committee and expects to start taking testimony on weatherization next Wednesday, and wants to hear from us on components of weatherization and workforce in particular from the climate action plan. And he has some discrete goals and asks. And I know TJ and Sarah Phillips and Maggie Gendron, our deputy secretary, and I are talking tomorrow, and we'll likely be reaching out to folks to help direct testimony on that. And he expects it to be the next 2 weeks, starting next Wednesday.
And I'll just add on the House side, Sarah Phillips and I testified yesterday regarding the governor's proposal on weatherization, which is $80 million between the low income and moderate income weatherization, and House Energy and Technology is very receptive. And it seems like Senator Bray's bill is, as Jane mentioned, really starting to focus on some of the long-term core issues of workforce and then sustainable funding in the long term.
TJ, your testimony was in what committee?
House Energy and Technology.
Oh, okay. And are you, at the moment, the expectation is that it's going to move in the budget, or is there some other expectation?
I have not heard anything to the contrary of that, but I may not be the best one to get into the nitty-gritty of where the next steps are.
Okay, well, sure. Understood. Environmental justice bill?
I can take a stab at the EJ bill, but can I just ask a clarifying question of the state team? In the governor's proposed budget, it said for low-income weatherization to be spent in FY 23 and 24, and then which is 45 million over 2 years. Love the idea, but maybe not possible.
Yeah.
So can you clarify for me? Like, it just is very clear that it says in FY 23 and 24, and then I thought I understood OEO saying over a longer time span. Can you put a finer point on that for me?
Yeah, Sarah and I both testified yesterday that the intent is to be obligated by 2024 and spent by 2026, consistent with the ARPA guidelines.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And unless someone else wants to speak to S-148, the environmental justice bill, I could give a quick update as I know it, and feel free to round it out. It seems like there's been a core sort of team of ANR staffers and a small subset of other EJ leaders and advocates, and it's in Senate Natural. And they've been deep in testimony for a couple of weeks, and there was potential for a vote today. I don't think that they got to that vote, but it's potentially likely that they will take that vote tomorrow. I think there's some pretty strong support for it. And then they're, I believe, like discussing a fiscal note to the bill, so actually funding it. So it's really strong progress, and I think a lot of people, including the state team and EJ leaders, have really been putting their shoulder behind it. So good news. Stay tuned.
Thanks, Joey. Any other legislative reports on issues related to the climate plan? I mean, those are some substantial actions already.
Is Chris on the call? Oh yeah, Chris. Chris, I'd love, can I ask a question of Chris Campany?
Please.
Hey, Chris, I understand, the testimony yesterday on the state planning office, and appreciate you directing them to the recommendation in the cap. I've been hearing that most people don't think that's going to go anywhere out of committee. I was just kind of curious what your impression of that was. I'm not sure if he's listening though. I think
I think he was on a phone call, Jane.
Okay.
One other thing, just to maybe note, it wasn't like it was sort of a mashup of different recommendations embedded in the climate plan, but H518, which is been in-house energy and technology, which is about a $48 million investment in municipal energy efficiency, resilience, fossil fuel reductions in municipal buildings. It passed out of House Energy and Technology on a 9-0 vote earlier this week. So that's a really important sort of, and it includes technical assistance from RPCs to support smaller communities in particular to assess and then avail themselves of the support embedded with in the bill, which is up to $200,000 per community to invest in municipal energy improvements in their buildings. So that's great.
That is great, and it's consistent with climate plan. So thanks for reporting. Anything else?
I put in the chat the transportation bill 522. Is that still in-house transportation? Joey or anyone else, is it moving along? Because we really need that bill to pass.
Well, they're in the process of bringing, as you know, the elements that the House Transportation Committee would recommend seeing and wanting to move forward into the must-pass T-bill. So components of it, I believe, will be moving forward. And yes, they're deep in that work. So, but I don't know if like Andrea or someone else from VTrans wants to provide a bit better update, but yes, Gina, they are embedding some of those important investments and provisions into the T-bill. It's my understanding.
Yeah, that's what I would have said as well, Joey. The T-bill is covering some of the aspects of 552, and I'm not sure what the status of it is in the committee. How much more they're going to dig into it. I think they were planning to next week, but then I heard that got pushed. So. I'm not sure if they're just sort of waiting to see where they get in the T-bill first.
All right. Anything more? That was good coverage. All right. Well, next up we have the Transportation Working Group report on process and the major ideas that are on their agenda. Joey and Gina, I'll just turn it to you.
Sure. I mean, I can start it off and then invite Gina and Jane and anyone else that we've been leaning on to sort of put our heads together as an initial stab at our suggested draft process and timeline to move this conversation and work forward. I think Jane shared with you, embedded in the agenda is the memo that we put forward that to sort of scope this out a little bit, but it's really just a starting point for a conversation. And Jane, I think you had some good questions that I think we need to resolve. But ideally those can be embedded into the feedback we're going to get from you all today. I think to really sort of begin to, focus the work and ramp it. So I think the conversation today is something I've been eager to have. But I guess one of the things I'd really like to sort of start with or conclude or walk out of this meeting with is, in the climate action plan for a couple of different things, but certainly for the transportation sector, we said we'd come back with a recommendation or set of recommendations by June of 2022. And that was, like we need to continue to make progress of setting timelines because of all the work we need to do is really important. But I think in sort of a small subgroup conversation that we've had with state staff and Gina and I and a couple other council subcommittee members, I guess our thought was that was sort of a self-imposed deadline and timeline, and that we might want to sort of push that out a little bit, recognizing that we do want to deliver and deliver soon, but we might need a little bit more time to go through a robust public engagement process, which we really want to do, and then do the assessment that we think is possible by October, in time enough for if there is legislative work or bill drafting that needs to happen, that sort of an October deadline could give a month and a half, 2 months worth of time to put potentially our recommendation into the legislative hopper. So one of the fundamental things that we are asking for, and I can sort of walk through the other components of our draft process and timeline, is to potentially revisit that question. So maybe I'll walk through the memo at a high level, although I don't necessarily need to walk through what you could read or might have already read, but I guess I would just hit a couple of high points, essentially saying, as you saw in the initial sort of context setting contextualization memo that we walked through in January, and that we will plan to update to pair with this process memo. We've identified at least two significant, sort of options that we want to really explore further and get public feedback on, which is analogous to the clean heat standard, sort of moving through the legislative session right now, is a clean transportation standard, modeled after what some other states are doing, and obviously something we now have experience in and can lean into to round out for the transportation sector based on the work that's been happening in the thermal sector and through the clean heat task group and work. So clean transportation standard, as well as looking at the Western Climate Initiative, which is a cap and invest program that our neighbors to the north in Quebec and California are participating in, which is similar to TCIP. It is economy-wide in Quebec, but there is the potential opportunity to tailor it singularly to serve potentially our transportation needs. So those two are the big sort of policy regulatory tools that we are recommending further examination of. And maybe they may not be the only ones, but as a starting place for further conversation, putting those two big ideas on the table, as and we've talked about a little bit before. Secondly, again, hearkening back to maybe the need for and the benefit of more time to do this, really wanting to focus in on the public engagement. Begun some very preliminary, thanks Chris Camedy, conversations with RPCs who are doing this work. But we need to really sort of focus in on, and we have outlined in that memo, a potential public engagement, the beginning of a public engagement and a public conversation about where from here. And as you've seen in the memo, essentially what we need to be doing now is sort of confirm how we might potentially partner with RPCs who do this work at the local level and play an important role in partnership with their communities and the state. But as a starting place, looking to sort of probably early to mid-March, maybe more so mid-March, putting together sort of a level set webinar where we would ideally strongly urge Climate Council members to attend, but have it be a public webinar where we would just give people a sense of where we're at in this moment, a sense of the options that we are exploring, and give them the opportunity to provide public input into where from here. And based on that feedback, continue to host a series of public input sessions, webinars. Maybe we get back to a place as we turn towards the sun and potentially pivoting out of this pandemic to holding in-person events, but sort of first webinar, high level, touch on the different ideas on the table, and then a series of webinars that would go more deeply into the sort of regulatory policy tools that we have that we're exploring. Throughout this, have the sort of transportation task group continue to meet and refine based on public input, next steps, and then continue to look and do the work we need to do to ground ourselves in the information we need to begin to, for ourselves and for public engagement, lay out the sort of parameters and the, the different components to the different approaches, WCI or clean transportation standard, that we're putting on the table. That is a very high level breeze through, walk through of it. I don't know if Gina or Jared, or actually Jane, Andrea, anyone on the state team wants to sort of round it out, but that's our initial thinking.
The challenge is going to be syncing up the knowledge we have about these various programs with the public involvement. So right now we have a certain level of knowledge and we can go out with that and we can talk about it and it's good, but we need to dive deeper into these program structures and costs and benefits. And that needs to go along in sync with the public involvement, and not knowing if we're going to have the money and how it's going to happen is it makes it, in my view, this is just my view. Now, I haven't talked to the group about this, makes it challenging to lay out a process. And in defense of that, we're not sure what the questions are that we want the researchers to help us answer. So there's a lot of syncing that needs to go on as we flesh out the proposals and we do our due diligence on public involvement.
And I guess last thing I would say is I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and the overview that we're going to hear on the pathways analysis with the updated numbers to understand, again, what's that say, like what's the gap we do need to fill, and then that will inform, you know, the further work we need to do in the analysis and the sort of exploration of other options we need to do. And frankly too, like how do we maximize the federal dollars, right? And which is what we were touching on earlier. Those can go a long way. How far can they go? What's the gap we need to fill?
So I guess I have one large scale question. At this point, do you all have an expectation that you're going to have to be working on at least 3 fronts, one being vehicle standards or vehicle incentives, another being fuel standards or fuel incentives, and the third being vehicle miles traveled, alternatives, land use, like 3 different big approaches to this problem? Or do you have a different way of carving up the challenge?
That's an excellent point, Rich, because there's all the things that need to happen in the climate plan that need to be tracked and implemented. And then there's this, how do we fill the gap presented by TCIP, which is something that's different. And from my perspective, we've only been talking about how we're going to fill the gap. We haven't been talking about, and I assume maybe somebody else was going to be doing that, keeping track of what the legislature, this H522 right now has funding for the programs that are recommended in the cap. So making sure that happens, making sure there's enough is really important. But it's not something we as a group have been coordinated on. Individual members have been involved, but yeah, it's just, there's a study that VTrans has to do around sustainable transportation so we can better understand the benefits of VMT reductions. What's going on with that? Checking in on the stuff that's in the plan versus we need more, because not everything in the plan is going to get us there. That's an excellent
Yeah, and
point.
I'll just say from VTrans perspective, we're just sort of trying to get all these things in order and understand what the pathways are and look to start to figure out what we do need to study more so that we can figure out what's the best return on investment for us and to get those reductions that we need. In the meantime, we're also focusing our efforts on like this huge sum of money that we have to get out on the streets really quickly. And so there's, you know, we've got a lot going on and we're certainly thinking about all those things. And we've got, you know, several different studies in the works, but they're not being implemented. We need to make sort of that implementation plan and figure out what are our next steps and where we go from here based on what's been laid out here and what's to come, you know, what's been laid out in the cap already and then what's to come to fill this gap. So kind of where we're at.
Jared?
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I just want to offer that, you know, in terms of the framework that you laid out, Rich, of those different categories, I think that there is some really important progress being made on a number of those fronts. You know, when you talk about kind of vehicle standards, the recommendation in the CAP moving forward around Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks, the vehicle efficiency price adjustment proposal that was in the CAP being considered in the legislature. I do want to say though that, I want to make sure that I'm kind of on the same page with others. The way that I think of the gap that we need to address is not kind of within a kind of sub-organization of transportation challenges and opportunities. It is because we have the legal requirement to meet our emissions reduction requirements by 2025 and 2030, we need to have policy and regulatory measures in place that give us a high degree of confidence that those are going to be met. And the way that I see it, we have performance standards either in existence or being proposed and advanced. On the one hand, the renewable energy standard, on the other hand, the clean heat standard, that give us a high degree of confidence about the emissions reductions that will be achieved from those sectors. I think what we are missing is a policy or regulatory framework that gives us the confidence that we will meet the transportation sector emissions reduction targets, which could be met by a cap and invest program because the cap gives the certainty, or it could be met by a performance standard program that ramps down emissions over time by nature of the program design. But what I think at least I would say, and I think I speak for the whole transportation task group that has talked through this, is that what we can't do is just hope that some short-term money that will likely be not available beyond 2026 in terms of the point that TJ made about appropriated by 2024, expended by 2026 for ARPA funds. That second half of the decade is when we really need to be ramping up the emissions reduction and the cost reduction activities if we're going, because the 2030 target is nearly 3 times larger than the 2025 target. And what I think we agree we cannot do is get to a point where funding is dropping off significantly in 2026 at just the time we need to be ramping up the efforts to make sure we meet the emissions reduction requirements. So I think that in the past, we've kind of spoken about the gap in the plan created by TCI. I don't see that as a funding gap. And I don't think even TCI on its own was going to be enough to make sure that we meet the scale of emissions reduction targets that the GWSA requires. But I do think, and that was really good feedback from this committee, including from Peter and from TJ last time, that I want to incorporate into a revised memo, that really what the gap is that was created by TCI is the lack of a policy and regulatory framework that gives us a high degree of confidence that we'll meet the emissions reduction requirements. And that will guide and transform market activity sustainably over time and not be dependent on short-term funding or one-time funding.
Jane, you have a comment as well?
I was just going to speak to the technical analysis funding and the current thoughts on that as a particular component. So we've been having a number of conversations internally around both how to advance the legitimacy and the analyses needed for rulemaking for Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks, and then how the certainty of the technical analysis we need in that space also then starts to build out and inform further technical analyses more broadly that we want in the transportation sector. And so we have an opportunity, the Climate Alliance grant that I spoke about earlier, that we intend to apply for the natural and working land sector for the greenhouse gas inventory, also has a technical analysis pot of money for transportation, and there are different pots of money. And so Megan was able to learn, and Colin, when they met with our Climate Alliance reps, that applying for one doesn't preclude us from applying for the other or impact us applying for the other, because they're different pots. And so Megan has graciously offered, and I think she's on, to take the lead on actually applying for a discrete amount of money, working to actually give money to NESCOM to work to actually get what we need on Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks, some more refined modeling and finer grained modeling on the emissions benefits of Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks. And then that sort of sets the stage for us to answer all the other layered questions of analyses and fund that separately. And Megan and Colin and I and Brian, others have been starting to talk about how to put forward a frame of questions. We've gotten some signal from Andrea and others at AOT that there's funding potentially in the budget of AOT and likely some leverage with the GWSA budget to support further technical analyses in the transportation space to help inform a recommendation to the Climate Council this fall. So state staff are working to sort of propose what state staff see as the right questions to continue to build out, to bring forward then that to see if we can marry that expectation with the amount of funding that AOT and ANR might be able to provide, and then bring that to the transportation task group to say, is this sort of in line with what you're thinking, and have a further conversation about technical analyses. But just want to put that out there that we are starting to think about that and pursuing different funding sources, and are excited to loop back up with the transportation task group in the next few weeks to have a more refined conversation about that component of the work. And the timing of the NESCOM study is something that we don't know exactly, but yeah, Megan just chimed in. She's working to figure that out.
And Jane, the timing on the sort of internal cross-agency figuring out, looking under all the couch cushions, assessing, you know, and like assessing that to inform.
Together. Yeah, I mean, in the next 2 weeks, I think we can all come together and talk about that.
Great.
I only say that because I'm on vacation next week. Maybe you guys can do it sooner, but I'd say 2 weeks.
So back to the very big picture that Jared painted. Is there, what I'm asking the transportation working group informally now, just informally, anything new added to your list of possible overarching policy mechanisms to fill the gap? Western Climate Initiative is one.
Clean
Anything else?
transportation standard, another.
A clean transportation standard, which could be Vermont only.
I mean, and then there's like the smaller stuff, and any epiphanies that you all have are welcome. But so there's like the vehicle efficiency price adjuster, and you know, we've had conversations about just straight up carbon pricing, and we're not pursuing that route at the moment because we think there are potentially other tools in the toolbox that would help deliver greater certainty. But again, if there are other components that you think we are missing, I think this is the moment in time to do a full analysis of the options before us.
I would also note that I think that, you know, it was really interesting to listen to the testimony, for instance, that happened on the clean heat standard last week or the week before. One of the folks that was invited to testify it was Corey Ann Wind, who is the Clean Fuels Program Director in Oregon. And one of the things that she said was that, you know, Oregon's approach, you know, their Clean Fuels Standard program is a part of a suite of actions that are meant to be complementary and work together, that they're not putting all of the, you know, eggs in the emissions reduction basket or all of the weight on just one policy, that there have to be these other complementary policies. And I think we all know and have discussed that, and that's certainly been part of the discussion in the Transportation Task Group, and was part of the CAP recommendations that the Climate Council passed and that this subcommittee worked on. I just bring it up to say that I think it's really important that in that memo we shared with this subcommittee and the council to say that those two ideas are not either or. They're not mutually exclusive. We may need multiple strategies to increase our level of confidence and to provide some market certainty and clarity about the transition and how to benefit folks in that transition. So, I don't see it as Clean Transportation Standard or the Western Climate Initiative. It may be, looking at both of them and considering both and potentially more. So that's just another perspective that I think is important in terms of having a diversity of strategies that complement each other to get to where we're trying to go.
Thanks, Jared. Well, it's certainly true that we've been delivering that same message with respect to the Clean Heat Standard as an umbrella that encompasses many complementary policies underneath it. And in that sense, it's a little different from the renewable electricity standard that it drives itself, even if nothing else is happening. But in transportation and in buildings, we know we need a whole raft of complementary policies. And so what you're saying is really, it's true for both of these other sectors. It's just, we need them in electricity as well, but the EPS, the RPS by itself does what it needs to do. It's better if it's complemented by demand side management, energy efficiency, and distributed resources and all those other things, but it is less dependent on them. Where in transportation and buildings, we know we need a suite of policies. Gina and then Joey.
Do we need to be thinking about, since this Clean Heat Standard is doing so well, is there anything that we need to think about in order to coordinate it with the transportation interest? Or should we just let the Clean Heat Standard bill work through the legislature and not muddy the waters?
So,
I mean, I don't know enough about each to say. It just seems like we have an opportunity here, or maybe it's too late. I'm just throwing that out there.
thanks, thanks, Gina. I've been involved in the Clean Heat Standard discussions and in the legislature as well, and I would say let it go. There's no need to make it more complicated. There have been some conversations about in the future expanding the idea of the Clean Heat Standard to include something like a low carbon fuel standard for transportation as an analog and not necessarily as one giant bucket. But I think that this is a big enough challenge right now, in terms of legislative attention and understanding, that I would not seek to expand it to transportation fuels. I invite comment on that. Joey?
I mean, I would agree. I said probably not this year, but I mean, once this ideally moves, through the legislature and it is in a good place, and that's like lessons learned and ability to potentially, if this rises to the top after, rigorous analysis and important public engagement, it may be something that, we could advance next year or beyond. So I think it's an important question, Gina, but I think Rich's assessment is right. I had my hand raised for another reason, and it's a little bit tangential, but if you haven't seen it, I mean, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I know VTrans and others are thinking about it a lot, but with these unprecedented federal dollars, the IIJA dollars in particular, they could really be helpful. And we need to really, I think, push forward, work and support our VTrans team and others and legislators to think about how to maximize those dollars for climate benefits. I would share with you, people probably know that Georgetown University supported the TCI and the TCIP work for a long time. And if you haven't seen this analysis they did related to the infrastructure dollars and how they could be incredibly climate beneficial, or also potentially harmful if we sort of use the lion's share to pave, expand, et cetera. So I'm not saying that that's going to happen here, but I think it's just, I just want to flag it and share it with people. That's just something to be cognizant of, because I think to close the gap of what we need to do, we have a huge opportunity to really direct these dollars to really strategic, like long-term investments.
Thanks, Joey. Next up, Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to just put out a pitch to also not to take our eyes off the land use piece of the equation too, and housing and how that ties into housing and future settlement patterns. By future, I mean like, you know, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, decade. Because right now, I feel like the need is, in me at least, the need is growing more desperate to really do more actual, like, physical conceptual master planning of where our compact settlements, you know, how our existing villages, what the infill opportunities are, how they can actually grow, how they can grow away from river corridors and floodplains, so that we actually know where we should be putting infrastructure investment dollars to support retaining what we've already got and expanding upon what we already have. And that would include also, I would say, you know, not just new neighborhoods, but potentially even new town centers. When I was in Maryland, we created a lot of new town centers, you know, that are compact and walkable and bikeable. Because right now, if you think about it, like in our region, our occupancy rate is probably less than 1%. Brattleboro's recent housing study, I don't think it's been formalized yet, says that their housing need right now is 500 additional units. And so if you're moving to Vermont from some other place, let's say you sold your home in Oregon or California for $600,000 and you're finally getting to move to Vermont, get away from the smoke. You know, your option, generally speaking, is a rural large lot and on a class 3 town road. And that's just going to continue to exacerbate all kinds of problems, whether we're talking about, you know, maintaining forest blocks and habitat, trying to avoid further fragmentation, you know, avoiding having to use cars in the first place, and maintain the roads, et cetera. So I just don't want us to lose sight of that while we're also looking at, you know, electrification of the fleet and everything else. Because if we don't get this future settlement pattern down, we're just going to continue to, you know, eat away at and undermine all the other things that the plan says has to happen. And so much of that, frankly, ties ultimately back to transportation. Transportation is just so intrinsically linked to land use. And so I'm not I just don't want us to lose sight of that, because I worry that we're going to. So,
Thanks, Chris. Really good point. And I guess I would say it also links to water and wastewater, because those compact settlements that you're talking about have to solve those infrastructure problems as well. Whereas the road network in rural Vermont already pretty much exists. And that's the problem you're pointing to. The roads are already there.
right, and without the water and wastewater, we're never going to get affordable housing at scale.
Right. So I'm just putting a point on the way infrastructure money needs to be invested, and you're making a point that it needs to be planned in order to be done. So I should take this moment to apologize to the committee, because I have a national roundtable meeting coming up at 1 o'clock. And at some point I need to turn the committee over to somebody else. And this further discussion on pathways, Jane has agreed to moderate, tee up that pathways conversation, if it's okay with the committee. I just want to make sure that the handoff is smooth and we take care of that now. All right, thanks, everybody. I see nodding heads. We'll just proceed that way. Kelly.
Before we moved away from this, I just wanted to touch briefly on the public engagement piece. I'm on the task group from Just Transitions that's working on further public engagement. And I was just thinking about the different types of engagement there are. We've been talking about this a lot in the task group. And one would be, I think you've pretty well outlined that you want to reach out to, key stakeholders, and the way you put it in the little memo, kind of what I'm seeing is people who may have some expertise may really want to dig into the policy and talk about how it's structured. Another type of engagement, though, might be just reaching out to folks from frontline and impacted communities and hearing their stories about transportation. What are their needs? What are their barriers? I think that would be really helpful, and that's an early thing. You don't have to have any answers yet. You can say, hey, tell us your stories. We want to hear. And then the last one is, once we do have policies and proposals, just getting the word out and saying, hey, these are coming down the pike, and getting it out to as many people as possible, just informing folks. And so we've been talking about the differences between engagement that's asking people to share their stories and talk to you, engagement that is getting folks who have an expertise. And I think that's in some cases, that's the easiest, because those people already want to be at the table and share their thoughts. But reaching people who may not think they have anything to offer, but really do because they have their stories, is going to be the tough one. And so our task group is already thinking about these things, and I really appreciate that you guys are wanting to do more engagement. So I'd love to have that be an ongoing conversation, how we can make sure that we are reaching people in all those different ways.
Thanks, Kelly. That's a great point. Absolutely agree. And it seems so obvious, and yet it's the right order of things. Any further comments on the transportation?
Both Chris and Kelly have raised really important issues that take effort and work. And, Chris's conversation was so reminded me of last year. We had that conversation, and what ended up in the plan was that VTrans and ACCD were going to do a study to see the benefits of concentrated mixed use development, so that we could then make a better case for encouraging it in order to reduce VMT. And we just got to stay on that and make sure it happens. And I'm not sure how that happens. And what Kelly just said is basic public outreach, which we didn't do before because we were swamped. And how are we going to do it in the future? I don't see it's going to take money, it's going to take effort, and where's it going to happen? It's just out there. So sorry for venting my frustrations, but all that stuff is so obvious, and I don't see the plan for getting there.
Thanks, Gina. Anything further on the transportation discussion before I turn the gavel over to Jane, or the guiding mic, or whatever it is? All right, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Rich. Joey or others, is there any other points of clarity or decisions that need to be made or say?
Well, can we go back to what I put on the table very early, which is, can we just do it with a 2 thumbs up, feel good about taking more time for public process and analysis and relieving ourselves collectively of the artificial deadline we set when we adopted the plan, and just make the case to the council that we'd like a little bit more time? So early October, mid-October, I just think would help with the public engagement piece and everything else. 2 thumbs up as our official vote. Any objections? Let me just say that. Okay, thank you for asking the question, Jane, because that was very important. So is that something, Jane, that we would need to get on the council's agenda on March 7th, or is it not?
I think we can just do an update, and there is a chance, there is a component on the agenda, because I just drafted it this morning for March 7th, that includes subcommittee updates. So I would just ask and coordinate that Rich and Peter update the council on the transportation conversations and the recommendation that the work will proceed into the fall.
Thank you. I would say nothing else pressing at this moment. but we will continue to do the work and look forward to collaborating with you, Kelly, and others on the task group.
Well, so the remainder of our meeting is intended to have a presentation of the final pathways report. You'll recall that there was a process laid out at our last meeting of this subcommittee to work through a number of smaller meetings to refine both the modeling for LEAP as well as the Implant modeling. We've had some various small group conversations, and the final report was produced and turned over last Friday, and I circulated it to the council and subcommittees over the weekend for you all to have ample time to have it with you ahead of the presentation today. But we have folks from both EFG and CADMIS here to walk through at a high level, but hopefully it'll draw in and present the final components of the modeling to date and provide a space for some conversation and questions, and then leave us with enough time to actually talk about what comes next with the modeling and reports, which hopefully we'll be able to preview and talk about some capacity building in that space. So David, I expect you're going to drive, so thank you so much for being here. And unfortunately, Liz had a conflict today, so David's going to be running the show with other members of the team who are joining him. So thanks,
Yep.
David.
Thank you, Jane. And I'll rely as we go along if you moderate kind of any questions in the chat and that type of thing. But our plan, as Jane said, is to leave time for discussion and questions this afternoon, but we want to go through a review of the modeling and where it's ended up and go over the high points for the revised pathways analysis report. I'm here with colleagues from CADMIS, Jeff Morrison, Cynthia Kahn, and Shantan Praviti, and then also Liz Bourdet from EFG. And Liz Hansen, again, had kind of a long-standing prior commitment, so wasn't able to join us, but she sends her regards as well. So let me share my screen and get the presentation up.
For members of the public, we posted this presentation just before the meeting had started, so it is available online also.
And let's see, that's not sharing in the way it's supposed to. Duplicate slideshow, how's that?
You stopped sharing when you hit that.
Huh. Oh dear. I always think I've got this sorted out. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Try again here. Share screen. And I'm going to try this. Share. And then we go like that. It says I'm sharing, but it's also a black screen for me, unfortunately.
It's still black for us too. It popped for a minute and then it went away.
There it is.
Now it's at your agenda. Yeah, there you go.
Is that it? Okay, so thank you, everybody. I want to thank everybody for the discussion that we just had. Clearly, this is not, a report or analysis or work that's just sitting on the shelf. The work in the legislature, the work that you're all doing to help to try to move things forward on this is immensely appreciated. And we hope that the initial pathways report and then this revised version is helpful going forward. So we'll go through today. What we want to do is talk about revisions that were in version 2.0 of this report. As a reminder, the first one was delivered in mid-November to inform the climate action plan. And then we've had very engaged review and comments from folks participating in the meeting today and others. And we've incorporated those both in terms of the narrative of the revised report as well as in some of the analyses, as Jane was talking about. We've had some individual small group meetings. So I'll go through at a high level what the analysis revisions were, and then we'll focus on the overview of the results in the revised report, the emissions and key indicators. We'll talk about the implant analysis in a little bit more depth. The implant analysis incorporated an opportunity cost analysis now. and then talk a little bit looking forward, building upon the discussion that you've just been having about in the transportation sector or others. There were some questions from Secretary Moore and Jane about the sectoral contributions target. If there were sectoral proportional targets, what would that look like? And that wasn't in the report, but it's some analysis we pulled together for today's discussion. And we'll leave a good amount of time for discussion at the end. So I'll move through these relatively quickly. The revisions that we undertook in version 2.0 of the report are summarized in this table. I won't go through them all in detail, but transportation, there was an important adjustment that reduced adoption early of EVs to reflect near-term supply constraints and OEM announcements, looking towards the adoption of advanced clean cars too, but recognizing that that wouldn't start until model year 2025, 2026. And so we reduced the adoption early. Advanced wood heat, there was an increase in the, basically the initial analysis didn't include high efficiency pellet and wood stoves. And then also wood heating ramped down more significantly in the earlier analysis than it does now. Wood still declines, but it maintains about 13% of heating by 2050 in the revised version. Environmental externality values, there was a calculation that wasn't happening properly in the earlier version of the model. And so the avoided damages, social, economic, and environmental, that are externalities have been increased in the overall results here by significantly by $3.6 billion. So they now total over 7.4, and I'll go through that. And Implant, the adjustments in the modeling then lead to a new set of inputs for Implant. Cynthia Kahn from Cadmus will review the Implant results with us, but the inputs for Implant and then the opportunity costs of net spending on the climate action measures are also now reflected in the analysis. So the summary results, the overall pathways analysis meets the GWSA requirement and actually exceeds the GWSA requirement in all of the time periods, so 2025, 2030, and 2050. This was the case before when we made some of these adjustments. We weren't meeting the requirements, so we made further adjustments, and now we are meeting and exceeding the requirements in all time periods. So in a sense, there's a little bit of conservatism built into this, and it's not absolute, it's not fine-tuned to the last metric ton, and also it allows for indicators here to be important milestones, but not necessarily. There's a little bit of headroom in terms of meeting the requirements. The summary of the economic results, one of the comments that we appreciated and got was that we had, say, the avoided fuel consumption, which is a savings to Vermonters, the avoided social, economic, and environmental damages. They were showing up as negative costs before. And so we've inverted those, the representation of those results. And those now show up as appropriately as savings. So this is the net present value of the total climate action plan mitigation pathway. And the total savings above the zero line, which is at the bottom of that blue bar, kind of where the two arrows meet here, is the zero. So the total net savings, the net present value of the savings with a 2% discount rate over the whole analysis period are 22 billion. And the total additional investments of about 16 billion. So a net present value of the savings of $6.4 billion. And this includes the avoided social, economic, and environmental damages based on the social cost of carbon. So by sector, just very briefly, transportation, Jeff Morrison is about to be on paternity leave any hour or day now, but he is joining us today, and we're very appreciative of that. So Jeff can talk a little bit about the next couple slides on transportation.
Sure, thanks, David. So you can see the the entire transportation emission trajectory here on the right. The kind of key metrics are listed in the table there to the left. The things that we hear a lot of benchmarks to. So the 2025 EV number. This is stock number, not sales. It's 27,000 approximately, and then by 2030, it's 126K. And the sales shares of new EVs are the next row down. So as David said, this is slightly less aggressive than our previous October-November plan. And you can see that here. So apologies for the small font, but the plan from this fall is on the bottom there on the right, and the new version is on the top. You can see there's fewer sales up to 2025, 2026, and then we kind of shoot up primarily due to Advanced Clean Cars 2. And this type of kind of discontinuity is actually what other states are projecting as well, that there's going to be the kind of surge of sales around mid-decade. Next slide. So this is total vehicle stocks, and I guess the thing to point out here is in 2025, the number of EVs among the whole stock, this is light duty and medium heavy duty, is still really pretty small, even though significantly larger than today, and then that grows over time out to 2050. There are still some internal combustion engine vehicles remaining in the stock in 2050. Back to you, David.
Sure. I'll go through these again relatively quickly. This is generally information and familiar from before. In the building sector, this is, again, the emissions reductions from the building sector, again, follow generally the same kind of level of path that we've seen before. The number of homes weatherized by 2030 is 120,000. In the modeling, I will point out that the pathways report and some of the discussions have looked at a ramp that will have 48,000 by 2025. The modeling and kind of one of the elements of overachieving the emissions reductions right now in 2025 is that 69,000 homes are weatherized in the 2025 range. Adjusting this for 48,000 would still be meeting the emissions reductions targets, but I did want to point that out. Heat pumps installed, I just saw something this morning that was saying California, the California Energy Commission adopted a target of 6 million heat pumps installed by 2030. And so there is now a firm target in California. They have about 14.4 million housing units. And so 6 million is about 40% of their housing units. So Vermont, although this number is certainly 177,000 by 2030 is not 6 million, that would proportionally be closer to 50% of housing units in Vermont. So again, we are progressive. We will be working, in markets like heat pumps and vehicles, similar to California, to attract attention. These are cold climate heat pumps. California's will be standard heat pumps, but again, just important for us to recognize that we're with these actions and with the Global Warming Solutions Act, et cetera, we're amongst a group of leading states, and we'll be it'll be important to continue to try to work with them in the markets and the manufacturers, et cetera, to be able to meet these types of targets. Another one of the updates or changes that we had in the revised analysis I mentioned before was maintaining this higher share of wood heating. Advanced wood heating maintains about a 13% share by 2050 in the updated analysis. Compared to earlier, it declined to about 8%. And the advanced wood heating is also more heavily dependent on high efficiency wood and pellet stoves. So it's 50%, and I think it's 80% by 2030 that all of the units are high efficiency. There's also to make up, I mentioned some of the earlier adjustments we made with the vehicles, et cetera. We were over the emissions targets. So some of the adjustments were to also then increase some of the other biofuel and renewable natural gas uptake in the building sector to help make sure that the emissions targets were met. And so there is more elements from the biofuels focused scenario in the previous analysis have been drawn into the central mitigation scenario in the revised final analysis. And so there's, you know, the impacts of these, a small reduction in electric demands and reduced decline a reduction in the decline of demand for wood fuels and a greater diversification of mitigation measures in the building sector. Non-energy, the key indicators and emissions reductions, these are largely unchanged from where they are unchanged. I think we had some comments on some of the narrative, but the analysis for this sector is pretty static from where it was before. We see emissions reductions across the agricultural elements, which are enteric fermentation, manure management, and ag soils. And then from ODS substitutes, ozone depleting substances, substitutes for ozone depleting substances, and semiconductor manufacturing in the non-energy sector. The electricity sector as well, we had very helpful comments, and we've revised the narrative in a number of places to reflect that it's important that the electrification of the transportation building sector obviously will have an increase in electric demands on the electric sector. The modeling that's been done with LEAP and for this analysis has a relatively modest level of, say, flexible load management and coordinated load management. And so as demands for electricity grow, those represent very important opportunities to try to help reduce the peak impacts that are required and to, you know, the capacity that will be required to meet the increasing loads. Just focusing on the nearer term, electricity continues to grow by 2025, 20% of the total share of energy by 2030, 30%. And EV charging, managed charging is one of the elements that is incorporated in the modeling, but coordinated loads across multiple loads, multiple sites, those types of things are not represented. And so we've reflected that in the reporting and in the narrative. Avoided social, economic, and environmental damages. It's important to incorporate using the social cost of carbon. So these are cumulative costs and benefits for the entire analysis period. The baseline with the social cost of carbon compared to the mitigation scenario. And there was the way in which environmental externalities are entered in the LEAP model. The LEAP model has a varying branch structure, et cetera. And one of a level wasn't calculating correctly. And so there was an update to the LEAP software that corrected that. And as I mentioned earlier, that increases the value of the avoided damages, social, economic, environmental damages from 3.8 to $7.4 billion. Those were in the model before, but they just weren't being captured and calculated and reported out. And so we've reflected those now both in the summary LEAP economic modeling, and then those damages, the avoided damages, importantly, are not reflected in the Implant results that Cynthia will review in just a second. So I have a couple more slides just to highlight some of this. The updated economic and Implant results. This shows, we've seen something like this before. Again, one of the things that very helpful comment was that before we had savings kind of as negative costs. And so in the earlier report, this is the zero line right here. And we had the savings, avoided fossil fuel costs and others were represented as negative costs, and investments were represented as positive costs. So we've inverted those charts and present them in the model as savings and costs. This represents by sector with the environmental, the avoided damages, social, economic, and environmental damages embedded in each sector. And so this one, for example, the residential, The investments in residential don't show up continuously in the weatherization and the heat pumps because the avoided damages are also embedded there. That becomes positive. And so the net value here is around the 500 million. The net value is, this is by year, and then the net value in each year. We see early investments. These are the costs outweighing the benefits. And then after this, the avoided fuels plus the embedded environmental damages after 2030 or so are outweighing the investments. And so we see net positive. Now, another way to look at that, because the embedded environmental elements in, say, in the residential sector, I did a version of that where I pulled those out, the avoided damages not by sector, but then represented these sectors and then put the avoided damages on top of that. And that shows then more consistently the costs that are associated with the mitigation options in each of the sector. Again, the costs being below the line and the avoided fuel use, as well as the avoided environmental damages above the line, and again, crossing roughly the same. Now, before I turn it over to Cynthia to talk about the implant analysis, it's important to recognize that our implant economic analysis, the avoided damages are, this relates back to the work we did earlier in the summer, but the avoided economic and social damages are global. And so it's not easy to take those and turn them into something like the implant evaluation, which is changes in spending patterns within Vermont directly. So this chart represents the annual net savings and costs from the LEAP modeling without the environmental, without excluding the social costs of greenhouse gases. And then this set of outputs is what Cynthia then used for the implant analysis. And that's a little bit of a technical point, but just one that I want to highlight because it's an important, so the net in the net investments without the avoided environmental, social, and economic damages is what's been analyzed in implant. And Cynthia, I'll turn it over to you for the review, the summary review of the implant and how we've been through that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. Hope everyone is doing well today. This brings us to the implant modeling results of our presentation. As David mentioned earlier, the implant model is based on a defined geographical area in this state, in this project, the state of Vermont. So we are unable to model things that occur outside of the state. So these are the inputs to our implant model. This is exactly what we got out of the LEAP process that David had described earlier. And we broke it out by sector so you could see where the positives and negatives are. And these are in a net present value over the entire 2020 through 2050 period that we are looking at. So you can see that most sectors, except for fuels, have a positive net increase in demand. And that would be, road transportation, non-energy, electricity, which includes in and out of state spending at this point. These are just our starting points. Fuels are the one area where most of these are imported. And so a lot of the main mechanism is that you are decreasing your importation of fuels by investing in local weatherization and other mitigation measures within the state. So the total is 1.1 billion, which is a number that David mentioned previously as the net present value of the total spending and savings for sorry, can you go back? I wasn't quite, I'm almost yeah, so 1.1 billion in net costs. And so what we do in our implant process is we take out anything that is imported or spent out of state. So a good portion of electricity drops down. A good portion of the negative fuels goes away because those are happening outside of our study area, and Implant again does not look outside of the state of Vermont. So the actual inputs that we have are going to be different than the total value out of LEAP. And on the right column, you can see the description, the general description of the industries of Implant that we had modeled to go with the sector scenarios. So for example, residential and commercial, most of that was, you know, home or building maintenance and repair and equipment. So new HVAC measures, weatherization, insulation, air sealing, that kind of stuff. For fuels, most of it was refined fossil fuels. There was also some direct selling operations that we modeled for firewood. And let's see, for non-energy, again, a lot of it was agriculture support services and also refrigerants for the HVAC systems. Okay, thank you, David. I'll go to the next slide. All right, and so our outputs, we did the modeling in two parts. The first part was the direct investments made through the mitigation scenario. So again, doing the weatherization, the electrification of the transportation sector, reduced VMTs, those are all part of the mitigation scenario, direct demand impacts. And you can see that if you look at the totals on the top box, you'll see 115,000 job years were the result of the employment, labor income, value added output. All of these indicators are positive across the board. And that's not surprising because the net values that we put into Implant were positive. That's expected. If you spend money in the economy without any offsetting cash flows, then you will definitely get positive impacts in the Implant modeling. So what we did was we tried to allocate some of that $1.1 billion to opportunity costs that accrue to the residential sector. So the second box shows the impact of the opportunity costs. So if people are paying an extra tax or they have extra outlays to comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act, then there is an opportunity cost, and that is just reduced consumption in other areas. And that you'll see it's negative for the opportunity cost, which is expected. And again, all of these values are relatively small, considering they're spread over 30 to 40 years. And so, you know, if you look at the impacts as a percent of the state's GDP, which is on the right-hand column, you'll see that they're fairly small, and they become even smaller when you look at the long-term horizon of these scenarios that we're looking at. At the bottom, you'll see the aggregate impact if you add the mitigation scenario to the opportunity costs. When you add those together, you still get positive impacts across the board. So that is really a really good outcome, and that's because a lot of your losses occur outside of the state of Vermont. You're not importing so much petroleum products, for example. More of the energy and fuels are generated within the state. A lot of the weatherization work, construction work to make these road improvements are employing local workers that stay within the state and then re-spend their wages within the state. So that is basically the mechanism by which we have such positive aggregate results from the Implant analysis. Any questions before we go on? So again, this is just another snapshot of the summary when you factor in the opportunity costs. And the bottom two lines is really where you want to look at. The Vermont's economy in 2019 has in 1 year, you have 440,000 workers. But the mitigation scenario, you see that generates a net positive of 110,000 workers, but that's over 31 years. So if you look at it again on a per year basis, it's less than 1% for the most part for all these indicators. The other interesting thing about the work that we've done, which aligns with what David found earlier, was that if you look at the top 2 rows of data here, you get the first 11 years, you're making a lot of investments, you've got a lot of opportunity costs, your impacts are not quite as positive. But if you look at the out years, so the 2031 through 2050 period, the impacts, the positive impacts really start to ramp up. And that's where you're reaping the benefits of all the initial investments that have been made in the first 10 years, 10, 11 years. Okay, now next slide. All right, you might be wondering, well, let's look at which industries are impacted. And we did that in this chart. You can see that the majority of the industries, which are along the horizontal axis, there's 500 plus implant industries. Most of them have fairly minimal impacts. You'll see tiny bumps, but what I wanted to do is look at like where are the big ones. And so we've labeled these big ones, the spikes by industry. And you'll see that, you know, the spikes are definitely from industries that are directly related to the mitigation scenario. For example, agriculture and forestry support corresponds with the non-energy sector improvements. There's construction, so there's 3 different types of construction, codes 52, 56, 62. These are all different types of construction, where it's like building maintenance versus road construction. So those are expected. On the right side, you'll see there's the biggest spike is in transit and ground passenger transportation. This is a mechanism by which the VMTs go down by improving your public transportation and roadways. So that is a sustained cost over the entire period, which is why it's such a large impact. And then you look at the smaller, like 400s, the early 400s are all retail codes. And you have some retail sectors that increase in their employment, and you have some retail sectors that do not. So for example, gasoline stores decline, small decline in non-store retailers or, you know, direct selling to customers. And then if we go to the next slide, we have some actual numbers to go along with that. So these, again, correspond to those spikes that you just saw. You'll see that the industries, biggest industry by far is the transportation and ground passengers. So it'll gain about 32,000 jobs. Construction and the different construction jobs around 20,000 jobs. And then you've got less than 10,000 jobs lost among the various retail sector. So any questions here before we go on? All right, I want to talk. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
I was going to say, we can move on to opportunity costs and how we looked at that. Oh, did we not include that?
Yeah, I don't have all of the slides. If there are questions on that, I have those as kind of some extra slides, but let's keep moving through. We'll finish up and then there will be plenty of time for questions on both the report and the presentation. If people want more questions about how we address the allocation of the opportunity costs, we can give more detail on that.
Yep, be happy to.
Okay.
Thanks, David.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for your attention.
Yep. So the last section here, Liz Bourget, a colleague of mine at Energy Futures Group, who has really contributed greatly to this project over time, will talk us through the last couple of slides. And these are in response to some questions that we had from Secretary Moore and from Jane on while the GWSA does not have sectoral, necessarily is broken out by sectoral target, proportional sectoral targets. There aren't requirements. The requirements are across the economy, but we wanted to look at what the plan entails by each sector and in each time period. And so we did a little further analysis after the report. These are not included in the report, but we just did these the other day, and Liz will talk us through a couple slides on that.
All right, thanks, David. So like David mentioned, we were asked to compare emissions from each sector in the mitigation scenario to emissions if each sector achieved the emissions reductions requirements of the GWSA. So for example, in this first graph, the green bar, so what we're calling sector targets, is what the emissions would be from each sector if they reduce emissions by 26% by 2025. And I'll just say that we know that the GWSA requirements are overall reductions in emissions across all sectors. But this analysis we thought would be useful to get an idea of how emissions reductions from each sector in the mitigation scenario compare to what each sector would achieve if the emission reductions were achieved proportionally. And I think that gives us a good sense of the importance of each individual sector in the mitigation scenario. So in 2025, we're seeing that most sectors are achieving or reducing their emissions below their sectoral targets, meaning like agriculture, residential, transportation, electricity generation are contributing more heavily to emissions reductions in the mitigation scenario than other sectors. And then you can see that commercial and industrial processes have higher mitigation scenario emissions than their sector targets. Next slide. So also, you'll notice that in the near term, in 2025 and 2030, the targets and the mitigation scenario emissions are mostly consistent, and we'll see bigger gaps come in the 2050 chart. But in 2030, it's again, you'll notice that the commercial and industrial processes and now transportation have higher cap mitigation scenario emissions than their sectoral targets. And next slide. So in 2050, we can really see the importance of transportation and electricity generation long-term. So we are thinking, so this illustrates the major transformation in the transportation sector, the expansion of EVs by 2050, and the complete transformation of Vermont's vehicle fleet. We can also see the importance of the efforts to reduce emissions from the residential sector, like weatherization efforts, the installation of heat pumps, and others. And also, this chart shows opportunities for sectors that aren't contributing as much to emission reductions in the cap mitigation scenario to meet their targets. So, for example, industrial processes in 2050, we see this as a major opportunity for longer term emission reduction strategy to reduce emissions from the sector, as you're seeing that the sectoral targets are much lower than the cap mitigation emissions. So next slide, yeah. So now we'll move to questions and discussion.
So that's a really, thank you, Liz, thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Jeff. That's a pretty high speed overview, but we wanted to leave time. We've got time for questions and discussion, both on the report as well as on the presentation. I can call back up the slides if it's helpful at any point, so feel free to ask for that, but I'll turn it over to Jane, or just I can take questions if people want to raise their hands, whatever.
I think that works fine. If you,
Christine?
I should have said, I think it works fine if you call in people, so thank you.
Sure, Christine.
Thank you for this great work. It's really good to see, and I think you did a very good job explaining the changes from the earlier version and the earlier work. I guess my question is really directed towards Jane, and I'm just curious how you/we see using this work moving forward.
Yeah, I don't, we will have access to the LEAP model. One of the benefits, as I know TJ and others have continued to reiterate, of why this model was chosen to be used in the first place, is that state officials will get trained in it and have access to run the LEAP modeling going forward. So we'll be able to make refinements and changes as things progress. As far as the larger report itself, we don't have any larger goals right now with the report or how to use it, but I expect it will continue to inform decisions and policy implications as we move forward. So love to hear from any of you if you have larger suggestions and contextual ideas about things we should and can be doing with it to make it known and available. DJ, go for it.
Yeah, and if I can, just a brief supplements to that is that one of the things that we are working on, and we're working on with TJ and with SEI, is to create a marginal abatement cost curve using the modeling and the input analysis that we've done. We weren't able to complete that and get that incorporated into the report at this time, but that's an output that we can look forward to. And then I think also the modeling, whether it's the state or continuing, can be useful in terms of those the metrics and milestones, the tracking and reporting. There's a fair amount that's in here that's a basis for tracking, reporting on a number of fronts across the different sectors. And so I think that the state will be able to benefit and use that in that fashion. TJ?
I was just going to respond to that in that manner. Thank you, David and Liz and Cynthia for the presentation. But David, you started with your presentation with this is not intended to be a report that's just on the shelf. It's going to be continued to be used, and I really appreciated that, because I think it's that's really critical as we monitor and start to take action and see where we are in terms of penetration of different technologies, and see, if we're behind our projections or ahead of them, and what that really means for emissions reductions. And maybe it's okay to be behind because we're getting emissions reductions somewhere else, or vice versa. And so I think continually updating and using the model. We're working on a training program for state staff and perhaps others to really get in a much better working knowledge of the model, so we can do this internally and go from there and really use it going forward.
Just real quick to build on that, I would just say that we are in the process of drafting the RFP for the measuring and assessing progress tool. And so I'm really glad that both David and then TJ further elaborated on how this all connects together and how we look at it and use it. So it's something we'll be thinking about and are thinking about, as a lot of that RFP is informed by conversations first with CADMIS and EFG and the task group of the Science and Data Committee that worked to put the measuring and assessing framework tool together and the scope of work. And now we're just further refining that scope of work to also be thinking about how that tool coordinates and speaks to the greenhouse gas inventory as well in a more thoughtful way, so that there's a public interface with that as well.
And, a lot of, yes, it's analysis, but it's analysis also that is somewhat broad brush, and the work that's going on in the legislature, and that you all spent the first part of the discussion talking about getting, those are the finer points that then are turning these into the actions. And so that's really helpful. It's meant to support, it doesn't do the work then, but hopefully it can continue to be a strong support. Joey?
Can I jump in one more thing,
Sure.
Joey?
Sorry.
Thanks. And I just wanted to mention, I almost forgot, is that we're also looking at taking the next steps of trying to disaggregate the statewide data in a manner to help regional planning commissions, to help municipalities to understand where they fit in the context of statewide emissions. And so SEI has drafted a plan for us that we're evaluating and going back and forth on, but over the next several months, hopefully we'll disaggregate, and then as part of the energy comprehensive energy plan, create tools and guides in order for those commissions and towns to, take the data and put it into their enhanced energy plan, so that there's kind of this connection from the broad state policy and modeling down to a more local level. And thanks, Joey, for allowing me to cut in there and finish.
I
that.
am so glad that you interjected because I love to hear that. That's really, I think that would be super helpful. Working a lot at the local level with the Energy Committee Network, I think that would be really helpful. So I'm so glad you guys are doing that. So happy to have given you the floor. So this is really helpful too, David and all. Thank you so much for the update. My question, and I apologize if you covered this already, but you made use very good reasons for the shifts in, the transportation, pretty significant reductions in short-term deployment of electric vehicles, for example, the implementation of advanced clean cars, advanced clean trucks, and then the inventory or lack thereof. Did you speak to, and can you tell me, like, what were the drivers that, what were your assumptions related to the pretty significant increases in the thermal sector? And like, so what were the assumptions that you made, or what sort of, what informed that?
I'm not sure if I'm clear on the question. I thought you were going to be asking, I was going to suggest Jeff can talk more about some of the, both the underlying analysis and transportation and potentially, kind of next steps to.
I get the transportation piece, but it seems like we're going to be focused a lot more in the thermal sector and meeting in the short term. So what there were assumptions are we making to make that happen, I guess is my question.
The clean heat standard kind of as increasing biofuels and having the levels of weatherization, the thermal sector is able, because it's early on, the reduction in the transportation is important. It means we're not meeting targets, but because it's relatively early on, you can make up the ground from the other sectors in a sense. If you said, well, no, the transportation can't do what it's projected to do, with the really large increase in the number of EVs, then I don't think you'd be able to find what do we do instead. But the reduction in EVs in that earlier phase, yes, we can pull in more elements from the biofuels focused scenario in the early one and still be meeting the emissions reductions targets. Is that making sense?
I mean, I just need to look at the numbers a little bit more, but maybe better understand it. But I'm, in terms of like, well, my mind always is in the like, well, bless you for doing the modeling and giving us a sense of that it's possible. But like, when it comes down to like, what are the policies and what are the programs that we need to actually actualize on the ground? I'm just trying to wrap my head around those. Are much bigger numbers in the thermal space to help make up for the decreased numbers in the short term in the transportation space. How are we driving that? Because clean heat standard, it's in a good place, but it's going to take several years. I didn't know if there was any other big thing that you guys had considered that I just would be helpful to be aware of.
I think the answer is no. It's a good question. Yeah. And we basically, we adjusted the modeling so that we would still be exceeding the emissions reductions targets. And,
I know, and bless your heart, and it shows it's possible. And then like, we have to figure out how to actually make it possible. So anyway, thank you.
The chat is active, and I'll just do my best to respond to Jared, your question about a timeline on the MAC curve. I think that all of you are aware that originally that Cadmus and EFG had that in their contract, but for a number of reasons, it makes sense for SEI to actually be the ones who deliver that. And we've been talking back and forth to refine what that looks like exactly, and then how to actually the fundamentals of paying SEI to do that. But I understand and expect that the contract holdup is not holding up SEI, but that they are currently working on that. Is that correct, David? And then the hope is that through a contract amendment with CADMIS and EFG, we'll be able to support SEI's work on that.
Yeah, we're planning to support them. I have not connected directly with Taylor. I've been rather busy the last couple of days, but I haven't connected with him on next steps, but I'll be doing that. I think, yeah, and he's ready to move forward with it. I don't know. I don't think he's given a specific time frame, but so it should be relatively, I would anticipate that it will be relatively quickly. When we talked about it before, it was kind of, would be possible within kind of a couple weeks rather than several months or something like that.
Great. Any other questions or comments before we move on to public comment?
I'm assuming that Taylor or Jason are not on the call.
Haven't seen their names, but
Okay, yeah, okay.
okay, seeing no other comments from subcommittee members, if there's anyone from the public who would like to comment, feel free to jump in or raise your hand and I'll happily call on you. Well, that was easy. So feel free if anybody else has any comments to pipe in, but otherwise, I do think that's all we had on the agenda today. So if anybody has any points of clarity or questions on next steps, there's still a few minutes for you to pipe up. Otherwise, we can adjourn a few minutes early.
I would like, on behalf of the CADMIS and EFG folks, again, to thank everybody that's been on this committee and the people who are listening in, the other state employees that are listening in, and everybody that's devoting, all their time to this. So thank you for continuing to work on moving it forward. It's great work.
Yeah, thank you to your team too, David, and the team at CADMIS, and being so receptive to all the feedback and ongoing meetings and conversations to hopefully drive and make the final product the best it could be. So it's been a pleasure to work with CADMIS and EFG through all of this. Okay, well, on that, it's 50 degrees and pouring rain here, so not ice for Gina, but hopefully everybody has a nice afternoon and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.